Sign it. You have 72 hours before the daily fines begin.
I looked at the paper. Then I looked at her. The violation was for my generator, a licensed diesel system my father had run legally on this property since 1989. Permitted, grandfathered, untouchable under county code. She either didn't know that, or she knew and didn't care. Either way, she just put her name, her title, and a timestamp on a document making a claim that wasn't true. And she'd done it with the easy confidence of someone who has never once been wrong about who holds the power in a room. I didn't correct her. I picked up the paper, I read it slowly, all the way to the bottom, including the section number she'd cited, 4.2.1, which I recognized immediately, and which I was already fairly certain didn't cover what she thought it covered. I set it back down. I folded my hands. "I appreciate you bringing this in person," I said. That was all. She waited for more. There wasn't more. She clicked her pen twice, said the fines would begin accruing on Thursday, and let herself out. I stood at my kitchen window and watched her climb back into her HOA golf cart, watched her write something on that clipboard, watched her drive away like someone who had just finished a task, neat and clean, no loose ends. She had no idea she'd just handed me the first piece. What I understood then, what 22 years in the Army Corps of Engineers teaches you, if you pay attention, is that people who are absolutely certain they hold all the power tend to move fast, document everything, and never once stop to consider that every record they're creating can be read by someone else. Carolyn wasn't my problem. Carolyn was her own problem. I just needed to let her finish building it. When someone hands you the first piece of their own undoing, do you stop them, or do you let them keep going? Let me tell you who I actually am, because it matters. My name is Marcus Webb. I spent 22 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, not combat, not infantry, not the kind of service that comes with dramatic stories. My service came with blueprints, site assessments, load-bearing calculations, and the particular discipline of men who understand that if you measure wrong, something falls down and people get hurt. I retired as a master sergeant. I came home with 2 bad knees, a habit of arriving 15 minutes early to everything, and a filing system my wife Dana calls a sickness. Dana teaches special education at Clearwater Ridge Elementary. She has been teaching for 14 years. She is the kind of person who spends her own money on classroom supplies without mentioning it, who remembers every single student's name years after they've moved on, and who has never once in our marriage asked me to fight a battle she didn't believe was worth fighting. When she tells me something matters, it matters. We are not people who look for trouble. We moved into my father's farmhouse 3 weeks after his funeral. The house was built in 1962. It sits on 2.3 acres of land that my father, Harold Webb, purchased outright in 1971, long before Clearwater Ridge HOA existed, long before the developers came through in 2001 and built everything around it, long before anyone named Carolyn Hatch had any authority over anything in this county. The farmhouse is not elegant. The porch has needed repainting for 2 years. There is a diesel generator system in a concrete housing on the east side of the property that hums on Thursday nights when my father used to run his weekly test cycle. I have kept that schedule. It felt right. I am not a lawyer. I am not an activist. I do not have a YouTube channel, a community Facebook page, or any particular interest in local politics. What I do have is a habit, ingrained so deep it stopped feeling like a habit years ago, of writing things down. Dates, times, names, what was said, what was signed, what was promised, and what was actually delivered. In the Corps, that habit saved projects. It settled disputes. It occasionally saved careers, including mine. I keep a legal pad on my kitchen counter. I keep a second one in my truck. The morning after Carolyn Hatch left my kitchen, I dated a fresh page, wrote her name at the top, and noted the time she arrived, the time she left, the section number she cited, and the fact that she had pre-filled my name on the violation form before knocking. It was a small detail, probably nothing. I wrote it down anyway. My father had a saying he repeated so often it stopped sounding like wisdom and started sounding like weather. Marcus, a man who swings first in the wrong fight, loses twice. He meant it practically. He wasn't a philosopher. He was a Korean War veteran who ran a small equipment rental business for 40 years and dealt with difficult people the way most difficult situations actually get resolved. Not with confrontation, but with patience, documentation, and the quiet understanding that time reveals everything if you let it. I used to think that was the advice of someone who'd learned to lose gracefully. I understand now it was the advice of someone who'd learned to win completely. There's a particular kind of person who mistakes restraint for weakness. They've usually spent their whole life rewarded for being loud, for moving fast, for hitting first and letting the noise of impact substitute for the actual merit of their position. They interpret silence as surrender. They interpret patience as helplessness. They read a person who isn't yelling back as a person who has nothing to say. That misreading is, in my experience, the most reliable thing about them. I had seen it in the Corps more times than I could count. The contractor who pushes too hard on a bid because he assumes the project manager won't check the numbers. The supervisor who falsifies a site report because he's certain no one will pull the original survey. The man who takes a shortcut on load calculations because he's done it 100 times and nothing has collapsed yet. They are not stupid people necessarily. They are people who have confused the absence of consequences so far with the permanent absence of consequences. They have never been shown the full invoice. I do not believe in revenge. I want to be clear about that. What I believe in is accuracy. I believe that what a person actually does, documented, time-stamped, laid out in the right order, in front of the right people, tends to speak with a clarity that no argument can match and no denial can outlast. I believe that the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who is behaving badly is simply keep an accurate record of it. I also believe, and this took me longer to learn, that intervening too early is its own kind of mistake. Stop a person at the first offense and you have a dispute. Wait until the pattern is undeniable, until the behavior has repeated and escalated and left enough of a trail that no reasonable person can argue it was accidental, and you have something different. You have a case. I wasn't angry at Carolyn Hatch the morning I dated that legal pad. I was paying attention. There's a difference. And the difference, in my experience, is everything. Is the man who refuses to swing first weak, or has he simply decided he'd rather win than just fight? Here is what was actually at stake, and I need you to understand this clearly before the rest of it makes sense. My father bought this land in 1971 for $4,200 cash. He cleared it himself, poured the foundation himself, built the house with 2 friends and a borrowed truck over the course of 1 summer. He raised me here. He buried my mother from the front porch. He ran his equipment rental business out of the back barn for 31 years, paid his taxes on time every single year, and never once asked anyone for anything he hadn't already earned. When the Clearwater Ridge developers came through in 2001, they didn't buy his land. They couldn't. He wouldn't sell. What they did instead was negotiate an easement agreement, which is a legal arrangement where a property owner grants specific rights across their land to another party. In this case, my father granted Clearwater Ridge Development Corporation the right to run their primary electrical conduit through the eastern edge of his property. In exchange, he received a lump sum payment and a set of permanent inheritable rights that transferred with the deed. That deed transferred to me. What that meant in practical terms was this: the electrical infrastructure serving every streetlight, every HOA clubhouse outlet, every irrigation pump and gate controller and security light in the entire Clearwater Ridge subdivision ran through a conduit buried 4 feet beneath my east pasture. 23 years of infrastructure. Hundreds of homes dependent on it. A homeowners association that had spent 2 decades operating as though my father's land was simply an inconvenient plot they hadn't gotten around to acquiring yet. Carolyn Hatch did not know this. More precisely, she knew the easement existed. It was in the county records, filed and indexed, but she had apparently never read it carefully enough to understand what it actually said. Or she had read it and decided it didn't matter. Or she had decided that a retired soldier and a special ed teacher living in a 1960s farmhouse were not the kind of people who read easement agreements carefully. All 3 possibilities led to the same place. The generator she was trying to find me into removing sat 12 feet from that conduit access point. I wasn't just defending a machine. I was standing on the ground that kept their lights on, and she had just put her name on a document demanding I move. The second violation notice arrived 11 days after the first. Same section number, same pre-filled format, different infraction. This time, unauthorized structural obstruction, referring to the concrete housing around the generator, which had been poured in 1989 with a county permit that was still on file at the Clearwater Ridge building office. I know this because I checked the day after the first notice arrived. Permit number 89-CR-0441, issued March 14th, signed by the county building inspector, whose name I confirmed was still in the county archive. I wrote all of that down. Date, permit number, archive location, name of the inspector. Then I wrote down something else. 2 notices in 11 days, different infractions, same section, same signature. No courtesy call. That last part was the one that snagged my attention and wouldn't let go. The week before my second notice arrived, I'd been at the HOA mailbox area picking up a misdelivered package when I overheard 2 board members talking near the clubhouse. One of them mentioned Skip Hendricks, a resident 3 streets over, and the fact that his RV had been parked in his driveway 2 inches over the property line setback for 6 weeks. The board member laughed, said Carolyn had called Skip personally, given him a heads up, told him to shift it before the next inspection cycle. No notice, no fine, just a friendly phone call. I stood very still and let that information settle. Skip Hendricks was a white-haired man I'd seen waving from his porch. Nice enough. His RV was a genuine violation. I'd seen the setback markers myself. He had received a courtesy call. I had received a pre-filled notice with a 72-hour fine window for a generator that had been legally permitted before some of Carolyn's board members were born. That was not a coincidence. That was a policy, an unwritten, selective, deliberately applied policy. In the Corps, we had a name for that kind of discrepancy. We called it a pattern, and a pattern is a different thing entirely from an incident. An incident can be explained away. Oversight, miscommunication, a bad day. A pattern is a choice, repeated, documented by its own repetition, impossible to credibly attribute to accident once you've laid the instances side by side. I pulled out a fresh page on my legal pad that evening. At the top, I wrote, Selective Enforcement, Begin Tracking. Below it, I started 2 columns. Left column, actions taken against my property. Right column, known violations by other residents and HOA response. I left wide margins. I knew I was going to need the space. This was no longer about a generator. This was about a person who had been operating without accountability for long enough that she'd stopped checking whether her actions were defensible. She wasn't being careful because she didn't believe she needed to be. That belief was going to cost her. She just didn't know it yet, and I had just started keeping score. Have you ever watched someone treat the rules as a weapon they only aim in one direction and wonder how long before it turns around on them? The third week, I started attending board meetings, not because I was required to, not because I had anything to say yet. I went because a board meeting is a documented proceeding. Minutes are kept, attendees are logged, motions are recorded, and I wanted my presence in that room to be part of the official record before I needed it to be. The first meeting I attended was a Tuesday evening in the Clearwater Ridge clubhouse, a beige room with folding chairs and a water-stained drop ceiling that smelled faintly of old carpet and burnt coffee. 7 residents, 4 board members. Carolyn at the head of the table with her laptop open and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead like a crown. She saw me come in. Something moved across her face, not quite surprise, not quite irritation. She wrote something on the notepad beside her laptop. I found a chair along the wall, opened my own notepad, and dated the top of the page. The meeting ran 41 minutes. I noted the start time, the end time, the names of the 4 board members present, and the fact that the HOA bylaws required a quorum of 5 board members for any binding vote. They took 2 binding votes that evening. I wrote that down too, with a small asterisk and the word quorum in the margin. After the meeting, as people were folding chairs and gathering coats, Carolyn walked over to me. She smiled the way she always smiled, from the teeth outward, nothing behind it. "Mr. Webb, glad you could join us. I plan to make it a regular thing," I said. A pause, just a beat too long. "The violation notices stand. I hope you're not here to make this adversarial." This was the moment. I want to be honest about that. I had enough right then. The permit number, the selective enforcement log I'd started, the quorum violations I'd just witnessed, to make a phone call to the county that would have caused her a significant headache before the week was out. I chose not to. "I'm not here to make anything," I said. "I'm here to participate in my community." She held my gaze for a moment, then nodded and walked away. I stayed in my seat until the room was nearly empty, wrote down the exact words she'd said, the time she'd said them, and 2 names of residents who had been standing close enough to hear. I could have ended it early. Part of me wanted to, but I had learned something in 22 years of project management that I trusted more than my own impatience. An incomplete case closes one door. A complete case closes all of them. I didn't want Carolyn to receive a warning from the county and adjust her behavior. I wanted every single thing she had done, and was still doing, to be visible, documented, and undeniable. She had more to show me yet. I could feel it, so I let her keep going. If you could stop someone from hurting you right now, but waiting meant they could never hurt anyone again, what would you choose? Over the next 4 weeks, I attended every board meeting. There were 3. Each one had the same problem. Not enough board members present for a legal quorum and binding votes taken anyway. I documented all of it. Start times, end times, names present, motions made, votes recorded. I wrote it in the same legal pad, same format, same margins. By the 3rd meeting, I had 6 quorum violations logged, with dates, attendee counts, and the specific bylaw section they conflicted with. Carolyn ran every meeting the same way, brisk, confident, slightly impatient with questions, completely unbothered by the idea that anyone in the room might be writing anything down. She had the manner of someone who had held this position long enough to forget that the position had rules. In that same month, my selective enforcement log grew to 11 entries, 11 documented instances where a violation by another resident received either no notice, a courtesy call, or an extended grace period, while my own notices arrived pre-filled, time-stamped, and escalating. A cracked driveway apron on Birchwood Lane, no notice. An unpermitted storage shed behind the Peltier property, courtesy call, 60-day grace. My legally permitted generator, grandfathered under county code since 1989. 2 notices, daily fines accruing, a lien threat now attached to the second notice in writing. I added that lien threat to a separate page, underlined it, dated it. The lien threat was important, not because it frightened me, but because it represented a documented, written, signed commitment to a legal action based on a claim I was already prepared to prove was false. Carolyn hadn't just overstepped. She had put her overreach into writing under her own signature and mailed it to my address with a certified mail receipt. She was generating her own evidence trail with the diligence of someone who believed it would only ever be read by one person. I kept thinking of a phrase my father used when he watched a contractor overbid a job so aggressively it became obvious. He's writing the check himself, just hasn't signed it yet. Carolyn was almost there. 60 days after Carolyn's first visit, I made my first move. Not a confrontation, not a phone call to the county, not a letter from a lawyer. One certified letter sent to the HOA board address requesting the complete enforcement documentation for all violation notices issued to all residents over the previous 3 years. Response times, fine schedules, courtesy call logs, board member sign-offs. I kept the language neutral, formal but not hostile. I cited the HOA's own bylaws, Section 11.4, which granted any resident the right to request records pertaining to enforcement actions affecting their property. I gave them 30 days to respond. Then I called Ray Dobbins. Ray had served as Clearwater County's assistant counsel for 19 years before retiring to a small practice downtown. He was 71, drove a 2003 Buick, and had the particular quality of stillness that comes from spending decades in rooms where people are lying and knowing exactly when it's happening. Dana had found his name in my father's address book, with a notation in my father's handwriting that said simply, "Straight Shooter." I drove to his office on a Wednesday morning with the easement agreement, both violation notices, the lien threat, my selective enforcement log, and my quorum violation notes. I laid them on his desk in order. He read everything without speaking. When he finished, he took off his glasses, set them on top of the stack, and was quiet for a moment. "Marcus," he said, "they need your land to keep their lights on." I nodded. I already knew. But hearing Ray Dobbins say it out loud in that office, with all the paperwork sitting between us, made it something different than a private understanding. It made it a fact with a witness. We spent 90 minutes going through everything. Ray confirmed the easement language was ironclad, permanent, inheritable, not subject to HOA modification without my written consent. He confirmed the grandfathered permit on the generator predated the HOA's own founding documents by 12 years, which meant Section 4.2.1 had no legal jurisdiction over it. He confirmed the quorum violations I documented were procedurally significant. Before I left, he said one more thing. "Don't show any of this yet. Let her keep sending paper." I drove home, added Ray's name and the date to my legal pad, and checked the tracking number on my certified letter. It had been signed for that morning at 9:14 a.m. The clock was running. Carolyn's response to my records request arrived on day 19, not the documentation I'd asked for. A letter, 2 paragraphs, HOA letterhead, her signature at the bottom, informing me that my request had been reviewed by the board and determined to be outside the scope of standard resident inquiry, and that the HOA was under no obligation to produce internal enforcement records to parties currently under active violation proceedings. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, slowly, the way you read something when you want to make sure you're not misunderstanding what you're looking at. She had just refused a lawful records request in writing on official letterhead, signed with her full name and title. I added it to the file. 3 days later, a notice arrived from the HOA's property management company informing me that a lien had been formally filed against my property with the county recorder's office for unpaid fines totaling $1,575. $75 a day, 21 days, compounding. The notice included a warning that continued non-compliance could result in escalated legal action up to and including forced remediation. Dana read it at the kitchen table that evening. She set it down carefully, the way she sets things down when she's working hard to stay calm. "Marcus." "I know." "They filed against the house." "I know." She looked at me for a long moment. "You have a plan." It wasn't a question. She knows me well enough that it wasn't a question. "Ray's already pulling the county recorder file," I said. Filing a lien against a property over a grandfathered permitted structure is itself a recordable error. Every day that lien sits there, it's accruing its own paper trail. Dana was quiet. Then she got up, poured herself a glass of water, and stood at the kitchen window for a moment. "They picked the wrong house," she said. She wasn't angry when she said it. She sounded almost sorry for them. Almost. I dated a new page on my legal pad. At the top, I wrote, "Lien filed, county recorder notified, Ray informed, clock running." Below that, I wrote, "They just added a third document with her signature on it." The November board meeting was the one where Carolyn made the mistake that changed the weight of everything. 11 residents attended that night, more than usual. Word had apparently spread that the new family on the old Webb property was causing friction, and people were curious. I took my usual chair along the wall. I dated my notepad. I uncapped my pen. Carolyn opened the meeting, worked through 2 agenda items, and then paused in the particular way people pause when they've been waiting to say something and have finally given themselves permission. "I want to address something directly," she said, looking at me, not glancing, looking. "It has come to the board's attention that certain residents have been submitting procedural requests designed not to resolve legitimate concerns, but to harass board leadership and obstruct the enforcement process." The room shifted. Several people turned to look at me. I wrote down the time, 7:22 p.m. "The board," Carolyn continued, her voice carrying the steady tone of someone who has rehearsed this, "has full authority under Section 9.1 of the HOA governing documents to pursue all available remedies against residents who engage in bad faith interference with board operations. I want everyone in this room to understand that we will not be intimidated by paperwork tactics." She said paperwork tactics, the way you'd say petty nonsense, with a small, dismissive turn of her mouth. I wrote that phrase down verbatim, circled it. Then I wrote down the names of the 10 other residents in the room, as many as I could confirm. 7 I knew by name, 3 I noted by physical description and seating position. When the meeting ended, a man I didn't know stopped beside my chair on his way out. 60s, work boots, the hands of someone who'd spent a lot of years outside. He looked at my notepad, then at me. "She do that to you too?" he said quietly. "Do what?" He glanced toward the door where Carolyn was still talking to 2 board members. "Pre-fill the notice before she even looks at the property?" I kept my expression even. "You got a violation notice?" 3, he said. "All of them wrong. Tried to ask about it once at a meeting." He paused. "She called me combative. In the minutes." I asked his name. He told me, Gary Pruitt, Linden Court. I wrote it down. When I got home, I added a new section to my legal pad, Other Affected Residents. Gary Pruitt's name went first. He was not going to be the last. How many people stay silent, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've never seen anyone stay in the room long enough to actually listen? By December, Carolyn had stopped handling things personally. That was the tell. People who are confident in their position stay visible. People who are starting to feel the first faint pressure of uncertainty begin to put distance between themselves and their decisions. They start working through intermediaries. They start building buffers. Carolyn hired an HOA enforcement contractor, a company out of Nashville called Meridian Property Solutions, to manage what she described in the board minutes as escalated compliance actions on my property. I know she described it that way because the minutes were posted to the HOA resident portal 48 hours after the meeting, and I downloaded and saved the PDF the morning they went up. Meridian sent 2 men on a Thursday afternoon. They drove a white pickup with a magnetic door logo, parked at the edge of my property line, and spent 20 minutes photographing the generator housing from multiple angles. They did not knock. They did not identify themselves until I walked out and asked. The taller one handed me a card. Meridian Property Solutions, Compliance Assessment Services. "We've been contracted to document the violation for potential remediation proceedings," he said. I looked at the card. I looked at the truck. I looked at the magnetic logo, the kind that peels off, not the kind you paint on when you're proud of your business. "You're on a public easement access point," I said. "Everything you photographed in the last 20 minutes includes infrastructure that falls under a recorded county easement agreement. I'd recommend your client's legal team review that before proceeding." The taller one looked at the shorter one. Neither of them said anything. "Have a good afternoon," I said, and went back inside. I called Ray from the kitchen. He pulled the Meridian business registration within the hour. A 2-year-old LLC, 3 active HOA contracts in 2 counties. No litigation history yet. He made a note. I made a note. What Carolyn had done by hiring Meridian was expand the circle. More people involved meant more documentation, more invoices, more contracts, more signatures on more pieces of paper, all of it traceable, all of it discoverable. She thought she was adding muscle. She was adding witnesses and a paper trail. It got wider the following week. At the December board meeting, 4 members present. Quorum violation number 9. Carolyn announced that the board had retained outside legal counsel to pursue formal remediation on the web property violation. She named the firm, Greer and Associates, Cookeville. She did not name the fee arrangement. She did not put the legal retainer to a vote. I wrote down, legal retainer approved without quorum vote. No cost disclosure to residents. Greer and Associates, Cookeville. Gary Pruitt was at that meeting. He'd brought his neighbor, a woman named Sylvia Tran, who had received 2 erroneous violation notices of her own over the past year, both for a fence that predated the HOA's own fence ordinance by 3 years. She sat with her hands folded and said nothing, but she stayed for the entire meeting, and she watched Carolyn the way you watch someone you've decided you no longer trust. After the meeting, in the parking lot, I stood with Gary and Sylvia in the cold for 11 minutes. I did not tell them what I had. I did not show them my legal pad or mention Ray Dobbins or the easement. I just asked them to keep attending meetings and to keep their own violation notices somewhere safe. They both said yes. The circle was widening, but so was mine. When a person in power starts hiring others to do what they used to do themselves, is that strength or the first sign they know something is wrong? There was a man named Paul Garrett on the HOA board. He had been on the board for 6 years, longer than any other current member, and he had the particular quality of someone who had started out with good intentions and gradually learned to look slightly to the left of whatever was directly in front of him. He was an accountant by trade, semi-retired, the kind of man who understood exactly what numbers meant and had apparently decided, at some point, that understanding them and saying something about them were 2 different obligations. I noticed him at meetings because he was the only board member who never spoke during the enforcement updates. Everyone else nodded, asked clarifying questions, made small affirmatory sounds. Paul Garrett sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at a point on the wall about 8 inches above Carolyn's head. The first time I caught his eye after a meeting, he looked away immediately. The second time, he held it for just a half second too long before looking away. That half second was its own kind of sentence. I didn't approach him. I didn't want to give Carolyn any reason to claim I was organizing opposition or interfering with board operations. She'd already used the word harassment once in writing, and I had no interest in giving that word any additional oxygen. But I started paying closer attention to Paul Garrett's silences, the way he didn't vote on the Meridian contract, the way he shuffled papers during the announcement about Greer and Associates, the way he was always the last board member to leave the parking lot, standing beside his car a little longer than necessary, as if he was waiting for the air to clear before he breathed normally again. At the January meeting, during a discussion about a proposed special assessment fee, another vote taken without proper quorum, I watched Paul Garrett pick up his pen, hold it over the sign-off sheet, and then set it back down without signing. Carolyn didn't notice. She was already moving to the next agenda item. I wrote it down. Garrett did not sign January special assessment. 3rd observable abstention. I didn't know yet whether Paul Garrett would ever say anything out loud, but I knew that a man who keeps his hands flat on the table while his board chair commits procedural violations has already made a quiet decision. He just hadn't found the moment yet where that decision became an action. I was willing to provide that moment when the time was right. How many people know exactly what's wrong but say nothing, not because they don't care, but because no one has yet made it safe enough to speak? The letter from Greer and Associates arrived on a Tuesday morning in late January. 14 pages, dense legal formatting, the kind designed to feel heavier than it is. I read all of it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before I reached page 6. The firm was threatening a formal injunction requiring physical removal of the generator system within 30 days. If I failed to comply, the HOA would seek court authorization for a contractor to enter the property and perform the removal at my expense, estimated at $4,200 plus legal fees, plus the accrued fines now totaling $3,450. They cited 3 county ordinances, 2 HOA bylaw sections, and attached a copy of the original violation notice as Exhibit A. Exhibit A. Carolyn's first document, the one she'd pre-filled before she knocked. I set the letter down and sat quietly for a moment. 30 days. That was the window. After that, they would go to a judge. And even with Ray Dobbins, even with everything I had documented, a judge seeing a stack of HOA paperwork on one side and a retired soldier on the other might take weeks to sort through the easement question. Weeks during which a contractor with a court order could show up at my property and start dismantling infrastructure that sat 12 feet from a conduit serving 300 homes. Ray called me that afternoon. He'd already received a courtesy copy from Greer and Associates, standard professional notification. "They're pushing the timeline," he said. "They want to force your hand before you can build a full response." I know. "Marcus, we're close, but we're not complete. The selective enforcement log is strong. The quorum violations are documented. The easement is ironclad. But I want the financial records before we move. If what I suspect about those maintenance contracts is accurate, this stops being an HOA dispute and becomes something the DA's office cares about. That changes everything, the lien, the fines, all of it. How long do you need?" A pause. 3 weeks, maybe less if the county records request moves fast. I did the math. 3 weeks inside a 30-day window, 7 days of margin, assuming Greer and Associates filed on the last possible day and assuming the court's calendar didn't move faster than expected. That night, I told Dana about the injunction. She listened without interrupting, which is what she does when something is serious. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Is Ray good?" she asked. "Ray is excellent." "Then trust Ray." She got up, kissed me on the side of the head the way she does when she's decided a conversation is over because she's already made up her mind about the outcome, and went to check her students' weekend assignments. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at Greer and Associates' 14 pages. 30 days. A clock I hadn't chosen, running on a timeline Carolyn thought she controlled. I pulled out my legal pad and started a new page. At the top, I wrote, "Day 1 of 30. Ray needs 3 weeks. Hold." Then I underlined hold twice and went to bed. When someone else sets the clock, do you panic, or do you use every second of the time they just handed you? Ray called me on a Thursday morning, day 16 of 30. He didn't open with pleasantries. Ray never does when something matters. "I have the HOA financial records," he said. 3 years. "The county records request came through this morning. Marcus, you need to come in." I was at his office by 10. He had the documents spread across his conference table in 3 separate groupings, weighted at the corners with legal pads and a coffee mug. Ray is 71 years old, and he still organizes paper the way lawyers organized paper before everything went digital. By hand, by logic, by the sequence that tells the clearest story. He walked me through it slowly. The HOA's maintenance budget over the past 3 fiscal years showed 31 contracts issued to a company called Pinnacle Property Maintenance, LLC. Lawn care, exterior painting, drainage assessment, clubhouse HVAC servicing, parking lot resurfacing, irrigation system inspection. 31 contracts totaling, across 3 years, just over $94,000. Ray set a second document beside the first, a Tennessee Secretary of State business registration printout. Pinnacle Property Maintenance, LLC had been registered 26 months ago. Its registered agent was a man named Douglas Pelham. Its listed business address was a residential property on Sycamore Creek Road in the next county over. Ray set a third document on top of the second, a property tax record. The Sycamore Creek Road address belonged to Carolyn Hatch's sister. Douglas Pelham was Carolyn's brother-in-law. I sat back in my chair and looked at the 3 documents sitting side by side on Ray's conference table. The room was very quiet, except for the sound of a heating vent near the ceiling and, faintly, traffic from the street outside. $94,000, routed through a company that did not exist before Carolyn needed it to exist, registered to a family address, managed by a family member, approved in board meetings that never had proper quorum, never disclosed to residents, never put to a legitimate vote. "Is there evidence of actual work performed?" I asked. Ray folded his hands. Some, enough to argue the contracts weren't entirely fictitious, but the markup is, he paused, choosing the word carefully, remarkable. The irrigation inspection alone billed $8,400. I pulled 3 comparable vendor quotes this morning. Average market rate for that service on a property this size is $600 to $900. I thought about the November board meeting, Carolyn's voice, steady and rehearsed. We will not be intimidated by paperwork tactics. The paperwork she'd been most worried about wasn't mine. It was hers. Ray gave me copies of everything, organized in a single folder with a typed index. Before I left, he said one thing I wrote down verbatim on the drive home, pulled over on the shoulder of Route 70 with my hazard lights on. Marcus, the generator dispute gave us the standing to request these records. Without her violation notices, without every piece of paper she signed and sent, we'd have had no legal basis to pull the financials. She handed us the key to the room she didn't want anyone entering. I sat on the shoulder of Route 70 for a long moment. Then I put the truck in drive and headed home to call Ray back with one question. How fast could he get this in front of the right people? What happens when the evidence someone tried to bury turns out to have been sitting in plain sight the entire time, filed, indexed, and waiting? Day 23 of 30, Greer and Associates filed for an emergency injunction. They hadn't waited for the deadline. They'd moved early, a calculated decision, Ray told me, designed to compress our response time and get in front of a judge before we could fully organize a counter-filing. The hearing was set for 6 days out, a Tuesday morning. Judge Patricia Waverly, Clearwater County Circuit Court. Ray called me the evening the filing came through. His voice was measured, the way it gets when he's managing something difficult and doesn't want to transmit the difficulty directly. It's not ideal timing, he said. We're ready on the easement. We're ready on the grandfathered permit. The financial records are another matter. That's a separate proceeding, a different threshold. I can't walk into Waverly's courtroom Tuesday and drop a fraud allegation without proper preparation. It muddies the injunction defense, and it tips our hand before the DA's office has had time to review. So we fight the injunction on the easement alone. Yes, and Marcus, we should win that. The easement language is clear, but Waverly is going to see an HOA with legal representation, a documented violation history, and 3 years of unpaid fines on one side, and 2 residents and a retired county attorney on the other. Judges have bad days. I want you to be prepared for any outcome. I told him I understood. I went to bed that night and didn't sleep well. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. Ray presented the easement agreement, the grandfathered permit, and a concise argument that the HOA's violation notices had no legal jurisdiction over a structure predating the HOA's own founding documents by 12 years. Greer and Associates attorney, a younger man named Fitch, confident in the way of someone who wins on volume rather than precision, argued that the easement did not constitute a blanket exemption from community standards and that the generator housing represented an ongoing nuisance affecting property values. Judge Waverly listened to both sides. She asked 4 questions. She took 11 minutes to review documents. Then she granted a partial injunction, not full removal, a temporary compliance order. I had 30 additional days to bring the generator housing into visual compliance with HOA aesthetic standards, or the full removal order would proceed. She cited the aesthetic nuisance argument. She declined to rule on the easement question, calling it a matter for a separate civil proceeding. I sat in that courtroom and felt the particular sensation of losing something you were certain you had a right to keep. Ray touched my arm on the way out. It's not over. It's not even close to over. This is one day. Outside, on the courthouse steps, I called Dana, told her what happened. She was quiet for a moment. What does Ray say? He says it's not over. Another pause. Then it's not over. I drove home. I sat in my truck in my own driveway for a few minutes, looking at the generator housing in its concrete pad on the east side of the property, 12 feet from the conduit that kept 300 homes lit. A structure my father had built legally, permitted properly, maintained faithfully for 34 years. A temporary compliance order now attached to it. I thought about Carolyn Hatch sitting in some room right now, getting a phone call from Fitch at Greer and Associates, hearing the words, "partial injunction granted." and smiling that smile of hers, the one that never reached her eyes. She thought she'd just won. She had actually just handed the DA's office a reason to open a file. Ray had made the call the morning of the hearing. Before we walked into that courtroom, before Judge Waverly said a single word, the financial records were already sitting on a desk at the Clearwater County District Attorney's office, delivered by hand with a typed cover memo and a complete index. Carolyn didn't know that yet. She was still smiling. Is there anything more dangerous than a person who thinks they've just won when the real count hasn't even started yet? That evening, I drove to Gary Pruitt's house on Linden Court. He answered the door in a work shirt with paint on the sleeve, the smell of something cooking behind him. I told him about the hearing. He listened without interrupting, arms crossed, jaw set in the way of a man who has heard bad news before and knows how to hold it without showing how much it weighs. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My wife cried when we got the third notice. She thought we were going to lose the house." He said it simply, without drama, the way people say things that have been sitting inside them too long to be dramatic anymore. I thought about that on the drive home, about Gary's wife crying over a violation notice for offense that predated the HOA's own ordinance, about Sylvia Tran, who had told me at the January meeting that she'd stopped planting flowers in her front yard because she was afraid whatever she chose would become the next infraction. About the residents I didn't know yet, the ones who had paid fines they didn't owe because fighting back seemed too costly, too complicated, too far outside the life they were trying to live quietly in a house they'd worked hard to afford. This had never been only about my generator. My father built that farmhouse with borrowed tools and 2 friends and 1 summer. He paid $4,200 cash for the land beneath it because that was every dollar he had. He maintained that property for 50 years with the particular care of a man who understands that what you build with your hands is an extension of your dignity, that how you keep a thing is a statement about how you value it. Carolyn Hatch had put a lien on that house. She had done it with a pre-filled form, a borrowed section number, and the absolute confidence that a retired soldier and a special ed teacher would calculate the cost of fighting back and decide it was too high. She had been wrong about that from the very first Tuesday she walked up my gravel path. But she had not been wrong about the cost. There was a cost. Gary's wife knew it. Sylvia Tran knew it. Dana knew it, even if she would never say so directly. The patience I'd maintained for 4 months had not been free. It had been paid for, quietly, by people who deserved better than this. I owed them a complete outcome, not a partial win, not a settlement, a complete, public, undeniable outcome. I drove home and called Ray. "Tell me we're ready," I said. "We're ready," he said. The February board meeting was not a regular meeting. Ray had requested it formally. A special session pursuant to HOA bylaw section 14.2, which granted any resident the right to call an emergency board review when presented with evidence of fiduciary misconduct. The request required signatures from 10% of the HOA's registered households. We had signatures from 31. Gary Pruitt had knocked on doors. Sylvia Tran had made phone calls. I had drafted the 1-paragraph request in plain language, no legal jargon, nothing inflammatory, just a statement that certain financial and procedural matters required the board's formal attention in an open session. 47 residents showed up. The clubhouse had never held that many people at once. Folding chairs were borrowed from the storage room and still weren't enough. People stood along the walls. The room smelled of winter coats and coffee from the urn someone had set up near the door. It was a Tuesday evening in February, and it was cold outside, and 47 people had come anyway. Carolyn arrived 6 minutes late. She saw the room, and I watched something move across her face. Not the smile this time, something underneath it. A recalculation happening in real time. She sat down. She opened her laptop. She attempted to call the meeting to order in her usual manner, brisk and preemptive, as if the size of the room and the reason for it were simply administrative details. Ray stood up. He introduced himself quietly. Retired county counsel, current legal representative for Marcus and Dana Webb. He thanked the board for accommodating the special session. Then he placed a single bound document on the table in front of Carolyn and asked her to confirm, for the record, that she was the serving board president and had been so for the previous 4 years. She confirmed it. Her voice was steady. Her hands were flat on the table. Ray nodded. He turned to face the room. What followed took 38 minutes. I have replayed it many times, and it still feels shorter than it was. Ray began with the generator dispute, not because it was the most significant matter, but because it was the beginning of the chain, and chains need to be presented in order. He showed the first violation notice, Carolyn's signature, the timestamp showing it was filed 40 minutes before she knocked on my door. He showed the grandfathered permit, number 89-CR-0441, issued 1989, predating the HOA's founding documents by 12 years. He showed the county code section confirming grandfathered structures were explicitly exempt from subsequent HOA aesthetic ordinances. He paused and let the room absorb that. Then he showed the second violation notice. Same signature, a different infraction citing the same concrete housing the first notice had already cited. He showed my certified records request and Carolyn's written refusal on HOA letterhead, claiming the request was outside the scope of standard resident inquiry. He read the relevant bylaw section aloud, Section 11.4, which stated clearly that any resident under active enforcement proceedings had the explicit right to request enforcement documentation. Ms. Hatch denied a lawful records request, Ray said, in writing, under her own signature, citing a justification that contradicts the association's own governing documents. He moved to the quorum violations. 9 documented instances across 7 months. Dates, attendee counts, the binding votes taken at each meeting without the required 5-member quorum. He read them sequentially, one by one, without commentary. The room was very quiet. Then he laid the selective enforcement log on the table. 11 entries. My violations on the left. Pre-filled notices, escalating fines, a lien filed against a legally permitted structure, comparable violations by other residents on the right, courtesy calls, grace periods, no formal notices at all. He read 4 of the 11 entries aloud. For the 4th one, he called Gary Pruitt's name and asked Gary to confirm, for the room, that the fence cited in his 3 violation notices had been installed in 1997. Gary stood up from his chair along the wall. 1997, he said. I have the permit. The HOA fence ordinance, Ray said, was adopted in 2003. He let that sit for a moment. Then he turned to the financial records. He presented the Pinnacle property maintenance contracts chronologically. 31 contracts, 3 fiscal years, $94,000 in total billings. He showed the Tennessee Secretary of State registration for Pinnacle Property Maintenance, LLC. He showed the registered agent, Douglas Pelham. He showed the business address, the Sycamore Creek Road property. He showed the property tax record linking that address to Carolyn's sister. Then he showed the vendor comparisons. The irrigation inspection billed at $8,400 against 3 market quotes averaging $780. The parking lot resurfacing billed at $14,200 against 2 comparable bids averaging $6,100. The clubhouse HVAC service contract billed annually at $9,600 against a manufacturer recommended service cost of $1,200. He set the documents down and looked at Carolyn directly. Ms. Hatch, these contracts were approved in board meetings without proper quorum. They were never disclosed to residents as related party transactions. They were never put to a legitimate member vote. The Clearwater County District Attorney's Office received a complete copy of this documentation 11 days ago. The room made a sound. Not loud, more like a collective exhale. The sound of 47 people realizing simultaneously that what they had assumed was one thing was actually something else entirely. Carolyn's lawyer, she had brought one, a man named Sutter, who had sat silently beside her through the entire presentation, leaned close and said something in her ear. She said nothing. Ray gathered his documents with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has done difficult things in difficult rooms for a long time and knows that the work is in the preparation, not the performance. Then he said the sentence I had been waiting 4 months to hear someone say out loud in a room full of people. On the record, every document used in this presentation tonight was generated, signed, filed, or approved by Ms. Hatch herself. We didn't build this case. She did. Paul Garrett, sitting at the board table, put down his pen and did not pick it up again. 3 days later, he called for a formal removal vote. The motion passed unanimously, 4-0. Carolyn did not attend. The DA's office opened a formal financial audit the following week. The document that gave investigators their entry point, the piece of paper that established Carolyn's pattern of conduct and justified pulling the full financial records, was her own notarized harassment complaint, filed against me in December, which had triggered the county's formal review process. She had handed investigators the shovel. I had just pointed at the dirt. When every piece of evidence against someone was created, signed, and filed by that person, what does that tell us about the relationship between arrogance and accountability? In March, the new board held its first official meeting. 5 members present, proper quorum, minutes taken and posted within 24 hours. The agenda was 3 items long, and every item was put to a legitimate vote. The first item was the dismissal of all pending violation notices and accrued fines against working-class residents who had been cited under Carolyn's selective enforcement policy. 41 notices, dismissed. The lien against my property was vacated by county recorder's order the following Thursday. Ray called me when it cleared. He didn't say much. Neither did I. Some things don't need words. The second item was a formal disclosure requirement. Going forward, any HOA contract exceeding $2,500 required 3 competitive bids, full disclosure of any vendor relationships to board members, and a resident vote for amounts over $10,000. Paul Garrett drafted the language himself. He presented it without fanfare, in the same quiet way he'd abstained from signing documents for 7 months, and it passed 4-0. The third item was the easement. Ray and the new board's attorney spent 2 weeks negotiating a formal agreement, transparent terms, fair compensation, properly documented, recorded with the county. The infrastructure my father had allowed beneath his east pasture for 23 years was now governed by a contract that acknowledged its existence honestly and compensated the Webb property accordingly. Nobody's lights went off. Nobody needed a dramatic confrontation. The conduit that had always been there simply became, at last, something everyone agreed to tell the truth about. Carolyn Hatch was formally charged with felony fraud in April. The DA's office cited 31 counts related to the Pinnacle property maintenance contracts, the overbilling, the undisclosed family relationship, the approvals obtained through procedurally invalid votes. Her attorney entered a not guilty plea. The case is ongoing. The document that opened the financial audit, the piece of paper that gave investigators the legal standing to pull 3 years of HOA records, was Carolyn's own notarized harassment complaint, the one she filed against me in December, in writing, under her full signature and title, because she had been so certain I was the problem that she handed the county a reason to look at everything. Dana framed the original violation notice, the very first one, pre-filled, time-stamped 40 minutes before Carolyn knocked, and hung it in our hallway. Matte black frame. She didn't tell me she was going to do it. I came home one evening, and it was there. I stood in the hallway for a long moment looking at it. It is, in its way, the most honest document in the house. It is a record of the exact moment someone decided we weren't the kind of people who kept records. Gary Pruitt's wife planted a garden this spring. Sylvia Tran put flowers in her front yard, bright yellow ones, the kind you can see from the street. I run the generator on Thursday nights, same as my father did. The test cycle takes about 12 minutes. It hums steadily, the way things do when they've been maintained properly for a long time. I still keep a legal pad on the kitchen counter, old habits. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply keep an accurate record and let the truth arrange itself in order. Have you ever watched someone build their own downfall one decision at a time? Tell me your story below.
But here's what this story was really about. It was never about a generator. It was never about a concrete housing or a section number or 72 hours before the fines begin. Those were just the surface. Underneath, this was a story about a particular kind of power. the kind that has gone unchallenged for so long it mistakes its own comfort for authority, the kind that looks at a quiet man with a legal pad and sees nothing worth worrying about. Carolyn Hatch wasn't a villain in the movie sense. She was something more ordinary than that. She was a person who had learned, slowly, over years, that the rules were a tool she controlled, not a system she answered to. She had learned that most people, when handed a pre-filled violation notice and a 72-hour deadline, will calculate the cost of fighting back and decide it's too high. She had been right about that so many times that she stopped questioning it. That certainty was her real weakness, not the fraud, the certainty. She lost because she could not imagine being wrong about who was in the room. Every document she signed with the confidence of someone writing a history that only she would ever read. The pre-filled notice, the denial of the records request, the lien, the harassment complaint. She generated her own evidence trail with the thoroughness of someone who never once considered that evidence runs in both directions. She didn't just hand Marcus the first piece. She built the entire case herself, one signature at a time, and filed it neatly with the county. Marcus won because he understood something she never did. That restraint is not the same thing as weakness. That silence is not the same thing as surrender. He came home from 22 years of work that required him to measure twice and never assume. And he applied that same discipline to the most important project he'd ever had: his father's land, his family's name, and the quiet dignity of people who had been told, implicitly, that they weren't worth the paperwork. He didn't fight her. He waited for her to finish fighting herself. And he kept a legal pad on the kitchen counter. Most people have met some version of Carolyn Hatch. Maybe not in an HOA. Maybe in a workplace, a landlord's office, a school board meeting, a family business. Someone who uses a little authority like a weapon, selectively, confidently, aimed only at the people they believe won't push back. Someone who has never been shown the full invoice for that behavior. The question I keep coming back to, and I want to know what you think, is this. Most of us, when we get that first notice slid across the kitchen table, feel the anger rise immediately. The instinct is to push back right then, to correct the record, to make sure she knows you're not someone she can do this to. Marcus let her walk out the door. He watched her write on her clipboard. He watched her drive away like someone who had just finished a task, neat and clean, no loose ends. And then he dated a fresh page on his legal pad. So tell me honestly, would you have let her walk out that door? Or would you have corrected her right there and lost the case before it ever started? If you think patience is its own kind of power, I think you'll want to stay around for what comes next.